Unanimity rules on the Iron Rings.
Board of Regents meeting will come to order for the purpose of considering the President's recommended fiscal 18 annual operating budget. And as a brief announcement, and I believe most of you do know, we had scheduled for 1 hour for this hearing. We have now extended this for to an hour and a half, and so the two respective committees were scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock will begin at 10:30. So those committees will have 1 hour time frame in which to conduct their business. We appreciate your consideration. Regent McMillan, I just thought it was appropriate we have a bit more time to discuss the budget. With that, Mr. President, if you would be so kind as to begin, and then we'll call on your staff. And the purpose, of course, Regents, is to ask questions, receive clarification on this budget. Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As always, my recommended annual budget reflects our values and builds on our strengths. It includes, firstly, appropriate compensation for our employees. I view this compensation as essential to recruit and retain talented employees. It's a merit-based compensation increase, and it will not apply to my senior executive direct reports that are approved by the board. We will freeze those executive salaries for 1 year. It also includes reallocation of resources, and it includes a few key investments to maintain our excellence. In terms of reallocation, we really have three main sources of resources, as will be detailed. They are our state appropriation, reallocations, and tuition. This budget has substantial reallocations. Over our operational excellence timeframe, that reallocation has included the elimination of 397 positions at the university. And although we have had some success this year on our state appropriation, we did not receive an adequate amount to enable us to freeze undergraduate resident tuition. And so we were asking for an increase ranging from campus 1% to 3% on the Twin Cities campus. A 3% increase is $376. That amount for low-income families will be, for the most part, compensated by increases in the federal Pell Grant and the state grant program. What is different this year is how we're conducting this first review of the budget. Together we decided this presentation should not come in the Finance Committee but to the Committee of the Whole. I think this is a good idea to engage the entire board in this first discussion of my FY 2018 annual operating budget. And to present this budget, I'll call on Senior Vice President for Finance and Operation Brian Burnett and Associate Vice President for Budget and Finance Julie Tonneson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Burnett, Ms. Tonneson, thank you for all of your work in the preparation of this budget and your presentation today. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Julie and I are here to summarize for you the major components of the President's recommended fiscal year 18 operating budget. And as you may recall, this process began even before my arrival last fall with a presentation in September that Julie did that outlined the budget framework, revenues and costs, and trend information with upcoming changes we anticipated at that time. That conversation was followed by a discussion in October on budget levers, specifically designed to deliver definitions and concepts that could help you frame your thinking on the budget variables. And finally, in March in Duluth, we brought more specific estimates on the framework variables we would consider in balancing the fiscal year 18 budget, the same general variables you will see in the budget before you today. So I'd like to ask Julie to walk you through our proposal for the fiscal year 18 spending plan, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burnett. Ms. Tonneson.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members. I don't know how to fix that screen. I'm just telling you. Sorry. Ta-da.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ms. Tonneson.
Okay, good morning. As the President mentioned, for the first time, we are reviewing the details of the annual budget before the full board. And so I want to take just a moment to orient you to what is in this presentation. It will be focused entirely on the FY18 annual budget in the context of the new state appropriations for the next biennium. As you know, FY18 is the first year of the next biennium that begins officially on July 1, and it is one of 4 parts in our cyclical budget development process. Part 1, we developed our request to the state of Minnesota. Part 2 is the FY18 annual budget that we are reviewing here with you today. Part 3 is the FY19 budget that we will begin work on early this fall. And Part 4 is a longer range financial planning and forecasting that we will bring before the Finance Committee later today and at various points throughout the year. So today is all about Part 2, the President's recommended operating budget for FY18. And in total, it is $3.9 billion. It's depicted here, broken down by fund group. On an all funds basis, this is up 2% from the FY17 projected revenues, or about $80 million, and we will return to that later in the presentation. On the left side of this chart are the local unit generated revenues. They are monitored and estimated during the budget process, but they go directly to the units whose activities generate that revenue throughout the year. On the right are the centrally distributed and attributed funds, which includes the primary budget framework, unrestricted funds of the state O&M appropriation and tuition, as well as the restricted state specials, indirect cost recovery, and central reserves. We will review each of these in turn later in the presentation. In graphic pie chart form, the distribution of the revenues across the funds is on this slide.
And our total revenues, again, about $3.9 billion. Of that number, in the blue slice there, are the internal sales, or money that travels between units within the organization. So we're really a double count. So on our income, we really have about $3.7 billion all in. And this is also depicted, as we've talked about, the different colors of money, where the tuition and the state support and the locally derived revenue is the most unrestricted money that the university has to solve its financial challenges. State appropriation is 17% of all revenues, where tuition is 24% of all revenues. And without that internal service organization, state appropriation is about 18.5%, and tuition is about 26% of the total pie supporting the University of Minnesota.
Focusing more specifically on the centrally distributed and attributed funds, the total there in resources is projected to be $1.796 billion, and the allocation of those funds is slightly less than that at $1.78 billion, leaving an ending balance of roughly $16 million, which is largely in central reserves. Again, we will get back to that in more detail in just a bit. Before we move into talking through the proposed incremental changes to the FY18 budget, I want to summarize changes in the state appropriation that had to be built into these plans and have directly contributed to other recommendations in the remaining parts of the budget. For FY18 alone, we did receive a 5.2% increase over our base funding, 6 items of increase and 1 item that was decreased. The individual funded initiatives are in the red box, but there are a few things of note on this chart. First, the biennial increase for FY18 and 19 is $54.6 million, or 4.4% over our general fund base. We requested $147.2 million, which would have been an 11.8% increase, so we received 37% of what we requested in terms of dollars. Second, $10,050,000 of that $54.6 million is one time. We will receive it only in FY18. It does not carry forward into the base for the next biennium, and you see that on the core mission support line. So the recurring increase over the base for the biennium is actually $44.6 million, or 3.6%. Our base funding for the next biennium will start at the FY19 appropriation times 2, which is the $1,297,000 in the red circle. In recognition of the reduction for FY19, this budget recommends allocating that $10 million of one-time funding to repair and renovation projects system-wide, to R&R. The distribution of the $10 million is displayed on page 10 of the budget document if you wanted to see that by campus, and is based on a formula that combines HEAPR-eligible square feet with an assessment of critical needs across that space. Given the lack of the bonding bill in 2016, the backlog of R&R projects has grown even more than normal. So this funding will serve some of the most critical repair needs we have and sets us up to not overcommit for the FY19 budget. Third, looking at FY18 and subtracting the items in the red box that were dedicated in law to initiatives and the non-recurring items. So if you take out the $10 million, the $7 million for health training restoration, the $4 million for Min Drive, and the $2 million for NRRI, that leaves us with an increase for core operations, for compensation, facilities, utilities, and so forth, of $10 million, which is an increase of 1.7%. And we will come back to that also on an upcoming slide. The total appropriations as listed in law for this biennium are shown on this slide. This is how the state money actually comes to us in 3 general categories. O&M, which is the first line and includes some riders that are noted here in law that direct funding to those particular initiatives. Then items A through E are the state specials. Those have not changed except for the NRRI, the Natural Resources Research Institute, increase of $2 million is actually added to item D on this chart. It's a state special. And then the third category of appropriations are below the blue line, which come from miscellaneous funding sources here, the Healthcare Access Fund and the cigarette tax, all of which goes to the Academic Health Center. As we move to walk through the incremental changes in all parts of the budget, I want to remind you of what the budget framework is that we have talked about at previous meetings and provide some updated figures that summarize that for the FY18 budget. As you recall from those previous discussions, the budget framework is a construct we use to explain changes, incremental changes in the budget. Beginning with this slide, the bulk of the conversation today will be about those incremental changes, talking about the resource and spending changes for next year compared with this year. This slide depicts the incremental changes in resources used to pay for the increases in expenditures. The budget for these framework funds is structurally balanced with $100,000 to spare. Incremental expenditures are supported by the combination of new state appropriation, increased tuition revenue, a small amount of other revenue increases, and internal expense reductions and reallocations. For the resource components, the changes from this year total an incremental new $71.1 million, and in pie chart form are summarized here. Just over 30% of that solution comes from recurring state appropriation, as we discussed. This is the full increase of $32.3 million for FY18 that was on the previous slide, less the $10 million of non-recurring dollars. Also, just over 30% of the solution comes from tuition revenue, $22.2 million from the recommended rate increases and enrollment changes that have been built into the FY18 estimates. And for the largest part of the resource solution, it is unit level resources at 38%, which includes support from some other revenues, support from FY17 tuition revenue estimates coming in above budget that are uncommitted and available to address FY18 costs, but mostly represents internal reallocations. We talked about the state appropriation, and we will talk in greater detail about the FY18 tuition changes coming up here in some future slides. But first, I want to turn to more detail on the 38%. Within the almost $27 million of unit level resources, there are several different pieces. First, $4.6 million in other revenues. In some cases, we can direct increases in ICR, fees, gift income, endowment earnings, and so forth to new costs. Second, some units are estimating tuition revenue gains over budget in the current year, as I just mentioned. That is $3.9 million we're planning to use for FY18. Third, in rare cases, balances are being spent on FY18 recurring costs as a transition to future cuts or revenue increases. Each year we turn to a small amount of this source for recurring costs, and for FY18 it is only about $700,000. And a fourth source here is cancellation of prior allocations. For FY18, there's $300,000 of recurring funds set aside centrally in prior years that are no longer needed for that and can be repurposed. The largest portion, though, comes from reallocations, over $17 million, reducing expenditures in one area and redistributing those resources to higher priority uses. Examples of this by some units are included in the budget document, most of which were administrative in nature, but it is important to note that reallocations occur in mission activities as well. For example, for FY18, the law school is eliminating 3 faculty lines to right-size and tailor expertise to meet student interests. The School of Dentistry is eliminating faculty positions. The College of Liberal Arts is reducing costs by eliminating small sections in low-demand courses, and so on. Overall, we expect about 73% of the expenditure reductions for FY18 to be personnel related and 27% to be non-personnel. Note the $7.8 million identified here as reductions to mission support and leadership and oversight. That $7.8 million identified as administrative reductions becomes part of addressing the President's goal to reduce administrative expenses by $90 million over 6 years. That began in FY14 with the performance goals that were put in law. In the first 3 years, items 1 through 3 above, we met the goals and submitted itemized lists of actions taken to the board and the legislature as required. FY17, the year we're currently in, is year 4. We updated information this spring on that, and it looks like we will come in just under $15 million. We will finalize that after the end of the fiscal year. FY18 is displayed in 2 pieces. The first is the reallocation target to help balance the O&M and tuition budget. That's the $7.8 million that was on the previous slide. The second part shows that we have given targets to units to make reductions in other non-sponsored funds as well. That includes sales and endowments, fees, the auxiliary funds, and so forth. So including that component, the total estimate for FY18 is now $10.6 million with an itemized list to be finalized after the end of the fiscal year. After 5 years with this budget, we will have accomplished 88% of our goal. That leaves $10.9 million for the final year of the plan, the next year's budget. The primary action taken to achieve these reallocations has been eliminated positions. Just related to the administrative reductions as separate from direct mission now. I'm not talking about the direct mission side. And in addition to reduced budgets for general operating costs, the major actions taken as part of this exercise are summarized here. First, as the President mentioned, in the first 3 years, 397 positions have been eliminated. These are administrative positions, and we're currently estimating 555 for the first 5 years. So the estimates for the current year are 89, and based on what units have submitted in their plans for FY18, there will be an additional, 69. The second action is salary savings. Units reevaluate positions to determine if work can be done at a lower percent time or by an employee with less experience or less skills. Third, we have closed or eliminated offices and activities. Some examples here include the Building Systems Automation Center, the Office of the Senior Vice President for Academic Administration, the University Bindery, the Plant Pathology Library, and so on. The fourth action, redesigned processes to reduce costs and gain efficiencies. A few examples of this include U-Market Services, in which the procurement process was redesigned. They reduced shipping costs, eliminated service charges, and negotiated new contracts. We also have a new parking program which now relies more heavily on automated services rather than in-person assistance. And in OIT, they have reduced capital and operating expenses by restructuring data and voice services. Those are just some examples. Fifth action is energy reduction. By revamping dining hood systems, relamping parking facilities, upgrading HVAC and ventilation systems throughout the institution, we have lowered utility costs. And then finally, another major impact is centralization through different forms of shared services. So for example, the Law School, Minnesota Extension Service, the College of Biological Sciences, among others, have eliminated general internal information technology staff and now rely on consolidated centralized information technology services. Another example, there's been further clustering of financial and HR services for smaller units. So the provost cluster, for example, provides functions around HR and finance for 7 different RRCs, or 7 different what we call units, I guess. These actions are continually taking place on a daily basis throughout the institution. Now, for tuition changes.
So the highlights of the tuition proposals in this budget here include, as the President noted, we're proposing resident undergraduate rate increases 1% on the system campuses in light of the competitive environment in which they find themselves in recruiting and to maintain excellence. And for the Twin Cities campus, we're proposing a 3% rate for undergraduate students for this, that are residents of the state. On 2, we're also continuing, as we've talked in the planning process, with a 10% increase on the Twin Cities campus for non-resident, non-reciprocity students. This will be the 3rd year of moving that number up. We have a 5.5% increase proposed on the Duluth campus for non-residents and 1% on the Morris campus. Our Crookston and Rochester campuses do not have a differential between in-state and non-resident. We are aligning our graduate and professional tuition rates with market conditions and peer institutions. Generally, they're 2 to 3%, but some vary. We have some professional programs at 0, and we have some at 5, and we can talk about that as we move through the charts. We do have campus and collegiate course fees, and these vary and are consistent with board policy, and Julie will walk you through those. And then another piece of cost of attendance is room and board, and those are driven by increased costs. So when you look at the bottom of this slide, really summarizing what the tuition and required fees overall would be: at Crookston 1%, Duluth 1.6, Morris 1.8, Rochester at 0.9, and the Twin Cities campus at 2.8%.
And we will, on some future slides, walk through campus by campus and talk about some of those changes. The primary rates for FY18 are shown in this chart. The full set of rates is contained in attachment 5 to the budget document. That will show the dollar amounts for FY17 and FY18 and the percent change year over year. The Twin Cities resident undergraduate rate here is currently, in the current year, 7 out of 14 in the Big Ten, and we will likely stay in that position. Rutgers is just $148 greater than the Twin Cities, so if they don't increase their rate at all, then we will move to the 6th place, but either way we are safely in the middle of the Big Ten. Some professional and graduate rates, as Brian mentioned, vary from our general 3% assumption. For example, dentistry is choosing to increase 2% higher than that general, so 5% for both resident and non-resident students. The demand is still very high for dentistry programs, and still their rates are still competitive overall against public institutions and below private research-based or for-profit institutions. And there also remains very good earnings potential for dental graduates. The College of Veterinary Medicine is choosing to implement increases lower than standard, again due to high debt loads for their students, lower learnings potential, and where their rate compares to peers. The medical school is choosing to implement a 0% increase for the incoming resident cohort for the 4th year in a row. They anticipate that they will be out of the top quartile of rates with that action, but still in the top half. They're proposing this plan to address the high debt loads of graduates and the need to incent those graduates to enter primary care that has a relatively lower earnings potential. You'll also see some variation in graduate and certificate rates. They are not all listed here, but are in attachment 5. But some examples where they are increasing more than 3% due to demand, other examples where they are increasing less, not surprisingly because of demand, and there's also some restructuring going on in the rates. Focusing on the largest percentage increase in this chart, if the President's proposed budget is adopted, the Twin Cities campus non-resident tuition will have increased roughly $7,100 over this 6-year period from FY13 to FY18, and that is versus less than a $900 increase for resident students during this time. In recognition of the relatively significant jump in the rates beginning mostly last year, and to assist with retention and the timely graduation of our currently enrolled students paying that non-resident rate, last year the President proposed and you approved a plan to hold increases for continuing students, those enrolled during this last academic year, to no more than a 5.5% increase throughout their time at the university, so through the 2019-20 academic year. This will be in place for FY18 for those cohorts of students, but we are not proposing to continue that for students entering in the fall of 2017. We've now completed 2 recruiting cycles with the 10% annual increase in these rates, and the early information for this coming fall looks as though we're predicting an increase in our NRNR enrollment of between 80 and 100 students to arrive at about 1,250, and that is all from the domestic side. The numbers of domestic applications decreased 20.7% for this fall, and tied to that, the admissions offers decreased almost 9%. However, the increased numbers we are projecting result from a higher yield rate, with confirmations up 3.5% over last year. As the application numbers were dropping, adjustments were made early in the process to the NRNR student recruitment efforts. On the international side, it looks like admissions will remain relatively stable to down slightly. Here, the application rates were also down, but admissions offers were up. But the confirmation rates at this point in the process from that larger offer pool are actually down. So we're going to be stable to slightly down. For the undergraduate resident tuition rates, this chart shows the proposed rate for FY18 by campus and what that rate was for each of the 5 previous years. Over this time period, the average annual increase by campus remains very low and below or equal to the CPI and higher education price index inflation rates over this time. Just 1.4% for the Twin Cities campus and 0.5% for each of the system campuses. For those that qualify for gift aid, such as Pell, the Minnesota State Grant Program, and Promise, the increases in those awards are shown here at the Twin Cities rates, but the increases on the system campuses would be just slightly less than these dollars. In all cases, the average increase in aid for many students would meet or exceed the increase in tuition. For a bit more detail on the $120 to $1,000 estimated for FY18 in that bottom right corner, let's first talk about the individual components of that are changing. The increase in the maximum Pell Grants will be an average of $105 per full-time student, from $5,775 to $5,815, which is a 1.8% increase. For the state grant program in FY18, the range of increase is rather significant this year. As we understand it today, the state is modifying the formulas in such a way that will distribute the awards across family income levels differently than in the past. So students more in the middle of that eligible range may see award increases larger than those at the bottom of the eligible income range. For many of the students eligible for these programs, the tuition rate increases included in this budget will be completely or largely offset by these aid increases. For the Promise program, we are recommending no changes for FY18. This program provides automatic aid to low and middle income Minnesota residents on all campuses. The awards for students from families with incomes up to $120,000 range from $306 to $4,134 annually, scaled to family income. And they are guaranteed for 8 semesters for incoming freshmen and 4 semesters for transfer students, as long as they maintain satisfactory academic progress. The combined impact of these tuition rate changes, fee changes, and room and board changes are on the next set of slides by campus. For each campus, these charts show the change in those costs from FY17 to FY18. They do not include the full cost of attendance because the costs of books, transportation, and miscellaneous items aren't included, as the board does not actually approve changes to those costs. So for Crookston, the increase in tuition and required fees is $115 or 1%. That's the tuition rate increase of $102 and a $13 increase in the student services fee that went through the student services fee process. That's primarily in two pieces, $6 for labor costs for their health services, and actually $6 is related to a reinstatement of a fee. It's not a new fee. It's one that wasn't in the chart for FY16 for various reasons, and they added it back in for FY18. Sorry, FY17 it wasn't in. It would be back in for 18. The room and board increase here of $143 is driven largely by labor costs. And again, auxiliary activities are charged with raising revenues to support their costs while controlling costs. So labor is a consideration in those fee increases. The overall increase you are approving for Crookston would be, for FY18, would be $258 or 1.3%. Last year, the increase on Crookston's campus was 0.8%, but the year before that, it was 1.8%. So 1.3 would be right in the middle. For Duluth, the increase in tuition and required fees is $205 or 1.6%. Outside of the tuition increase of 1%, the primary driver here is the combined impact of changes in the student services fee, up $20, and the proposed increase in their other required fees, which now reflects the proposed athletics facilities fee. This proposal would treat the new athletics fee much like the stadium fee on the Twin Cities campus, moving it to a campus operational or administrative decision outside of the student services fee process, increasing it roughly $26 for FY18, from at $58 as it was within the student services fee to $84, those are per semester rates, to support the costs of Division II athletics on the campus. The collegiate fees are also going up a little, $8 per year, to support increased costs of career and library services. And the room and board increase here of 2% is also driven by labor costs and some transportation costs that are embedded in their vendor charges. So overall increases you would be approving for Duluth for FY18 would be $353 or 1.7%. Last year the increase was 1.5% on the Duluth campus, and the year before it was 2.2%. For Morris, the tuition and required fees would be increasing $226 or 1.8%. Tuition at 1% as on the other campuses, and then a $70 increase in their student services fee that is primarily in three different components. $22 for the Student Center and Edson Auditorium renovation, $20 for athletics facility upgrades, and $26 for the Health Center, which includes increased costs for current mental health services and a new contract for physician services. Again, that went through the student services fee process on the campus. This fee did not go up at all this year in FY17. The campus fee increase of $18 per semester represents the first increase in this fee at Morris in 5 years. And to remind everyone, by board policy, this fee supports a variety of general student services, including advising, technology and computer labs, career services, and so on. The increase in room and board at Morris of $236 or 3% is largely driven by maintenance and labor costs again, as on the other campuses. So overall, the increase you are approving for FY18 would be $462 or 2.2%. Last year at Morris, it was 0.5%, and the year before that, it was also 2.2%. For Rochester, this remains an uncomplicated chart for the second year in a row, with just the 1% increase in tuition leading to a 0.9% increase in tuition and required fees, and then a 0.4% decrease actually estimated for room and board, which is driven by their methodology they use to estimate board costs, and they use a Twin Cities based number, and that's going down. So it's going down slightly as an estimate. Overall, here you are approving an increase of 0.4%. Last year for Rochester, it was flat, so 0, and the year before that, it was 1.6%. And finally, for the Twin Cities campus, tuition and required fees would be up $396 or 2.8%. Tuition would be up 3%, and then the fee changes net out to a negative 2.2% change. For the student services fee here, a 1% increase would be $9 across 6 administrative units, such as Recreation and Wellness, Boynton Health Service, and so forth, 5 media groups, including the Daily and Radio K and others, that get a portion of their operating funds through this process, and over 70 student organizations that are all identified in Attachment 10 to the budget document. The collegiate fees, there are 2 changes on the Twin Cities campus. The College of Science and Engineering, we are proposing a $30 per semester increase in that fee. That would be the first time that college has increased the fee in 6 years. And then a new fee for the Academic Health Center of $183, and that would be for students in programs such as occupational therapy, clinical lab sciences, and a few others that are not enrolled in any other college and receive all of their student support services through the Academic Health Center, for which they have not been charged a fee to this point. The room and board increase on the Twin Cities campus of 4.5% has a single primary driver, which is the 3% supplemental housing rate increase as part of the planned rate ramp up to fund the renovation of Pioneer Hall and the consolidation of the super block dining approved by the board in the FY17 annual capital budget. With this increase, the Twin Cities room and board rates are projected still to rank 12 out of 14 in the Big Ten, just $50 higher than number 13, Purdue, and $512 under number 11, which is Michigan State. So overall, campus, the increase was 2.9%, and the year before that it was 1.9%. One last slide on tuition and fees. As Brian mentioned, we'll talk just briefly about some of those miscellaneous fees. That once again, they are in line with the last several years. There are a variety of changes. They center really around 4 different circumstances that are outlined here. When we have new courses and groups of courses or activities in an existing course that change or increase, you will see an increased fee in the fee attachments. The examples here are another study abroad option in nursing, for example, that's going to show up as a new fee. A second consideration is for areas where the costs covered through the fee are increasing significantly, or they have increased steadily over time, but the fee hasn't changed. There's, again, a couple of examples identified here for music education, instrument maintenance, and for different supplies and engineering labs. And then third, we have some fees that are actually just pass-through, where an external vendor is responsible for the charge, and we just process it. The university does not actually gain revenue through that activity, and we have some of those that are increasing. And then finally, we do restructure fees occasionally, so you will see some of that in the fee attachments as well. The primary one here is a proposal to change the way we are charging for online course fees on the Twin Cities campus from a flat fee for all credits over 2 to a per credit fee. So students will pay more, less, or greater than what they paid this year, depending on their situation. In the boxes, you can see that for course fees, 80%, just like last year, there are no changes or they are decreasing. For the miscellaneous terms fee, 77% have no change or are decreasing. And then for the academic fees, we talked through the collegiate fee changes already on some previous slides. And with that, we move into information related to the investments in the budget to kind of close the circle on that a bit.
So this is a graphic overview of the roughly $71 million of incremental spending proposed in our budget in descriptive categories. And in years past, the most significant increase as a category is for compensation, followed by core operations and services, and then increases in our facilities and technology infrastructure. I think, again, as the President pointed out, compensating our highly qualified and motivated staff is certainly an important facet of this budget, and keeping them moving with inflation is certainly core to this entire budget. And you can see that it's half the spending in this entire budget proposal. Julie?
We will look at the slices of the pie in more detail, starting here with compensation. This budget recommends a 2% general salary increase, which, when combined with fringe, leads to an incremental cost increase in the state and tuition funds only of $34 million, which is shown in yellow here. Stepping up a level, the total compensation costs, all funds, for FY18, we are estimating to be $2.2 billion. That would be 2.2 of the $3.8 billion estimated to spend in an all funds basis. The total increase in costs for compensation, all funds, from FY17 is estimated at $63 million. $34 million you see here on this chart in the state and tuition dollars, but there's another $21 million in other non-sponsored funds and an estimated $8 million increase in sponsored funds. The fringe component of this is up due to approximately $12 million of a legal settlement that was put into the fringe accounts in FY15 that has the impact of, because of the methodology, of lowering the FY17 fringe costs. So that significant increase from 17 to 18 is not due to changes in benefit costs or offerings. It is due to the methodology that held the 17 rate, if you will, artificially low. So there is a significant increase between FY17 and 18. A second piece of the pie that's also on this slide is student aid. There's a very small amount here, $336,400 for required matches as part of the President's Scholarship Match Program. This happens to be for undergraduate and professional students for FY18. As you know, we monitor annually to see if base funds are sufficient to cover requirements under this program, and where they're not, where they are insufficient, we add that to the budget. And finally, this slide includes the $2 million in the blue slice of the pie that we are proposing in this budget to hold for the FY19 budget. In the face of no new funding from the state for FY19, this gives us a little leg up in that budget process. We will spend this $2 million on non-recurring items in FY18, but it will be uncommitted as we move into the FY19 budget process. The remaining slices of this pie are detailed on this slide. The full list of investments is actually included in attachment 1 of the budget document, but we'll highlight some of the components here quickly. The largest category here is for basic operating budget support, which is $15.9 million. Almost half of that, or $7.8 million, of this represents a conscious decision to put state money, new tuition, and reallocated resources back into the budget of units, not for new initiatives, but to maintain current operations, often driven by revenues coming in less than expected or recent cost increases. For FY18, this decision was made for a number of units, including most significantly the School of Dentistry, the Law School, and the Morris, Crookston, and Duluth campuses. This category...
Excuse me a moment. Yep. We really need to get through this because we have a number of questions and comments from Regents, so if you can get to the...
Talk faster or leave stuff out.
You've done great work.
Bet.
It's not that. You spent a lot of time and effort. We appreciate it.
We'll leave some stuff out.
We have it before us too, so.
You bet. We'll leave some stuff out. I do want to mention that in this particular area, all of those state initiatives, so MnDrive is in here, the NRI funding is in here, the health training restoration is in here, so those are a significant part of the new investments that you see on this slide. All of these are recurring. Again, they're on attachment 1. And there's also in attachment 1 the list of the non-recurring investments as well. That's the end of the incremental state and tuition fees information. Very quickly, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but these are also centrally distributed and attributed funds that we at least want to mention. One is the indirect cost recovery funds, which, as you know, are given to the university by sponsors to fund some of the overhead costs associated with research. We're projecting a $1.5 million decrease from 17 to 18. That's actually less of a drop than we've seen in recent years, but it is the 7th year in a row that they are recommending or proposing a decrease in the budget. And then the summary slide for central reserves is here. And here, we have talked about this in the Finance Committee numerous times, so I won't go into great detail, but the swings that you see in the Central Reserves Fund are often related to the timing of revenues and disbursements, and so some of that is what you're seeing here. The other thing I'd like to point out is that this does include the loan to athletics for their coaches transition that has been discussed previously. That will go out in FY17 with payments coming back into the fund starting in FY18. So that is reflected here as well. The ending balance is, and at the end of FY18 would be just over $15 million. And then finally, before we get to some real summary wrap-up, we wanted to provide 3 different scenarios related to a reduction in the resident undergraduate tuition rate. All 3 options or scenarios pivot off the President's recommended budget for FY18, which you can see on the row 1. Then we have 3 different scenarios. Scenario 1, starting on line 2, shows what the imbalance would be created by lowering the rate on the Twin Cities campus to 2.5%. Scenario 2 on lines 4 and 5 shows the impact of a resident undergraduate tuition freeze on all campuses. That would create an $11.2 million hole. And for scenario 3, the impact of a decrease of 1% in the resident undergraduate rate on all campuses from what they are today would lead to a $15.7 million hole. In each case, we've highlighted some options in reducing investments to get to a balanced budget under these scenarios, and we've highlighted the changes in green. The most significant being in scenarios 2 and 3, where we would propose dropping the compensation assumption from 2% to 1%. Then finally, before we move onto the discussion of these scenarios or any other parts of the budget, I need to apologize and ask for your indulgence on just 2 slides that I put together Tuesday night after continually trying to synthesize all this information. So these were not provided in advance of today's meeting, but give us a little bit of summary information related to the budget. I thought it might be useful for discussion purposes to put into context, first of all, the inflation rates. The most recent rates for CPIU and HEPI are both hovering right around 2%. This budget includes estimated revenues, as we've mentioned, of $3.93 billion, up $81 million, which is 2% compared to FY17. It also includes estimated total expenditures at $3.92 billion, which is up $91 million, again, 2% increase compared to FY17. And I felt it was important to note that 69% of that 2% increase in spending is related to salaries and fringe alone. 46% of it for the 2% salary increase plus the associated fringe, and 23% is actually related to that fringe methodology I described just previously. This budget, I also want to highlight the change just in the state funds and tuition combined. If you just look at those, here the total budgeted revenues are up, as we discussed, 3.5% or $55.2 million. But that includes some items in the budget from the state that were line itemed and go for specific things and not available for core operations. So if you remove those, the increase available for general operations is again 2%, and the allocations are going up 2%. Within the 2% increase in O&M and tuition dollars, 1.7% is related to it, or there's an increase in the state funding of 1.7%, an increase in the tuition revenue of 2.5%. So combined, those two generate a 2% revenue increase to support the allocations. We thought that might be useful in trying to sort of summarize or put a bow on top of the budget, if you will.
So, yeah, wrapping up, this is the resolution that was typically brought forward, Mr. Chairman. With that, we're happy to take any questions that the board has about this proposal.
Very good. Thank you much for your presentation. I'm going to call on Lauren Mitchell on behalf of the student representatives to make comments at this time, and then we're going to open it up for comments and questions by the regents. Ms. Mitchell, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair Johnson, members of the board, President Kaler. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today and appreciate your flexibility with timing as well. I want to make 3 comments on behalf of the student representatives in response to this budget. First is a huge thank you for the investments that show responsiveness to the community's concerns, including student concerns. The first of these is student mental health. This has been a priority for student advocacy for the past 2 years at least, as I'm sure you're well aware. The MSA president and vice president had it in a central position on their platform in 2015. COGS and PSG formed a joint committee that worked last year and this year to enact change on the Twin Cities campus through programs like the Mental Health Advocates and mental health surveys. The Student Senate presented a resolution last year that looked at things from a system-wide perspective. And then last year and this year, student mental health was a main priority of the student representatives' report to the board, as well as the budget forum last year. Last year, we saw the addition of $200,000 in the budget to hire staff here on the Twin Cities campus, and that made a huge impact. This year, we see $283,000 devoted to system campuses for student mental health, plus continued incremental progress on the Twin Cities campus, though the details of that are not quite clear from the budget documents. We are really grateful that our voices are being heard and that students, especially on the system campuses, are going to be getting much needed help in response. The second area is sexual assault and sexual misconduct prevention. This has also been a focus of student engagement and advocacy. I apologize, I'm not so familiar with what's been going on the system campuses, but I know that this has been a priority of MSA in 2014-2015, and again this year with the Fund Aurora campaign. Here we see a $300,000 investment in support for sexual assault prevention and Title IX support. Again, thank you for responding to advocacy with these generous investments. I would like to make a few comments on the presentation of the budget as well. This year, I've tried to talk both about substantive issues with you as well as how students interact with the Regents, how you can access the community's perspectives to best inform your action. And I would say that this budget is very budget process centric in its presentation. It's organized around categories like core operations and services that might make sense to you and to the budget office staff and administration, but maybe not to other members of our community. How the information is organized makes it hard to see and evaluate how the resources are being allocated. So for example, what's our total spending on career services? What's the trend over time? Career services are distributed in several different places at the university. They're at the college level, they're in the graduate school, they're in the Center for Academic Planning and Exploration. And there's not enough detail in the budget reporting. Combining that with the decentralization and disjointed structure of the university, it makes it impossible to answer questions like, how much are we spending on career services, just looking at these budget documents. And that means that we can't place responsive investments like what we're seeing in student mental health and sexual misconduct prevention into context. I spent some time with the budgets of our peer institutions. I can look up the total budget for counseling services at the University of Michigan, but not at the University of Minnesota. I can tell you in broad terms how the Sexual Misconduct Initiative at Michigan impacts their budget. The size of the line items for prevention and education, Student Conduct Office, and the Dean of Students Office. For the University of Minnesota, I can tell you it's $300,000 plus something. I want to reiterate how grateful and appreciative that we are for the substantial investments that respond to our community's most pressing needs. I've spoken with several of you personally about student mental health, about sexual misconduct, and I know that these are serious issues that are important to you, that you care about, both regents and administrators. It's encouraging to see those verbal commitments translated into action like this. These investments are going to have a direct positive impact on the lives of students in real and tangible ways. However, I think we can do a better job of communicating clearly, and there are models for how this can be done effectively. The way we're doing things now obscures the information, and this is disempowering to individuals in the community. I've talked with you about access to different voices and perspectives. Being able to read, digest, and engage with these documents empowers our community to participate and hold the university accountable. I encourage members of the university administration and the board to consider how this information can be presented most clearly and transparently so that we can all engage in open discussion on the budget. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mitchell. Any questions or comments for Student Representative Mitchell? Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. Ms. Mitchell, am I correct in assuming that you are satisfied with the amounts of investments that we have for mental health and sexual misconduct?
I'm very, oh, sorry. Thank you, Chair Johnson. Thank you, Regent Hsu. I'm very encouraged to see the investments, particularly on student mental health, which is one of the most important things to me personally. And I know to many students, it's been one of the issues of most engagement on this university, I think. I'm really pleased to see these investments. I think that we still have work to do in terms of strategic planning. I would like to see us doing more intentional work on that end of things, and I think that may inform future investments, but I'd like to see us doing that planning. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much for your efforts. Okay, members of the board, it's your turn to ask questions, make comments in regard to the fiscal 2018 budget. Members, it's your opportunity. And keep in mind that this budget will be presented to us on Tuesday, June 20th at 12:30 for final consideration. Regent Simmons.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. Thank you for the presentation and all that's behind it. This is a necessarily complex budget, but in my eyes, it's also a commendable budget. I do want to highlight a couple of things that I think we need to be attentive to at the leadership level. One is, when we talk about administrative reductions, I don't think we have a consistent, clear idea of what that is, what an administrator is. Some of the administrative functions, if you will, are really are essential and critical to the core mission, and cutting those, you risk research funding, you risk allegations of federal fraud. These are very serious things to attend to, and I doubt that that's widely appreciated, and in areas I don't have any knowledge, I'm sure there are more things like that than just what I highlighted in research. The second thing I would comment about reductions, our mission isn't to reduce costs. Our mission is to deliver on the mission. And that's our purpose as a university. And I do admire the university and the president's leadership in saying we are going to reduce as many unnecessary costs as we can. I admire that. I think that is accountable and responsible. But we have to be very careful we don't compromise the mission. And you reach a point where we would. I think we already are hearing some of the necessary cuts because of reallocations are in course offerings. Some are in faculty, and maybe those are great ideas. Maybe they're highly responsible, but we need to note that we are making those cuts. Local management, local accountability says that's where we can do it. But I think we need to watch that carefully. And finally, I'd say that with the state funding level that we've now received, and with what we've done to take out any unnecessary cuts, look at how we're distributing funds internally. And I think you start seeing a hybrid model emerging at the University of Minnesota, where you effectively have colleges that have more public funding, and you effectively have colleges that are funded by tuition and private sources. It's the endowed and public hybrid that we are moving to. I'm not saying that's bad, but I do think it needs to be acknowledged, and I do think we need to be careful how we help with that by setting principles to guide that internal allocation.
Thank you, Regent Swimmons. Regent Powell?
Thank you, Chair Johnson, and thank you very much for your very detailed and very thoughtful presentation. So I have the first question I have, which is really one of clarification. It is a question around the whole effort around administrative cost, which I think has been very productive and very diligent over the last 5 or 6 years. So, and which has resulted in the elimination of 555 positions. I think that was the number. So the question is has total employment at the university declined as well? And the reason I'm interested in that is because I'm interested in how much of the efficiency that we've created administratively, how much of that has been reallocated to other programs, important programs, as you just heard from Regent Simmons, and how much has been allocated to do what we can do to control tuition cost increases, which is, of course, another vital constituency. We want to control tuition costs. So I'm interested in how we divide, if you will, the benefits of increasing efficiency between programmatic and managing tuition. And then, of course, the reason I'm interested in that is because I'm just very concerned about doing everything we can to control tuition increases. My read, I think you said university inflation is around 2%. The inflation, the core inflation that our people who are buying the service is less than that. It's between 1 and 1.5%. And I'm very uneasy about tuition increases, that would be more than 1.5%, kind of the rate of inflation that our consumers are seeing. I'm uneasy with the cost of higher ed increasing higher than the rate of inflation. And then the last comment, which is maybe a comment for my fellow regents, I do appreciate the great work that's been done to increase, efficiency within the university. I think we're going to be under continuing cost pressure in future years. And so one topic I think we're going to have to take up is how we transition from the 6-year plan that we've been on to an ongoing effort around administrative and other cost efficiencies, because I just think we're going to need that, and maybe that's a topic for another day, but thought I'd put it on the table. Thank you.
Mr. Burnett, Ms. Coniston?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regent Powell, we'll take them backwards. We do know that once we're not to the 90 million in administrative efficiencies, which would take place in fiscal year 19. I think all of us that help lead and guide this university know that we're not going to be magically there when we're done, and we're going to have to keep looking for and working towards greater efficiency. So I think we've said that in the Finance Committee. We've said that under Chair Beeson's leadership, but we've got to finish getting to the 90. The great news is we're 89% there to that commitment that President Kaler made. Secondly, I think we have to dig beneath the numbers on staff, because as we add research grants, we don't just sit on that money. We hire people to go do research, and they in turn pay taxes to the state of Minnesota. So I think we need to be careful about headcount numbers without looking beneath about the source of funding, because if nothing else comes out in these numbers, and Julie we can talk about that, it's a very complex budget. And yes, there are people that are funded from tuition and state support, but there's also a big group of employees that are funded off sponsored funds. And so to artificially keep them from, to think about that. Additionally, like our veterinary school that creates revenue through treating dogs, cats, and animals of folks in our community, they hire people to do that work. So I think we've got to be a little more, rather than just think about it in one great big bucket, that there are various fund sources that support different physicians on our campus and across this entire enterprise. And I think we've got to look at that. I think we just pulled some data in advance of today, and Julie, I think we added, even with all these cuts, net numbers when we dig through it with hiring and people leaving the university, we were up about 300 employees last year. We would have to do additional analysis of what drove that. But I can tell you that a lot of it is over in these other areas where they're generating their own revenue, because it's not money coming from the center when we're making these administrative reallocations. Julie, did you want to comment on that?
I would just add, Mr. Chair, Regents, and Regent Powell, to that point in particular, we don't have with us today the data going back years. But I will tell you that working through this all these years, there is an understanding in the units that we are trying to, as the president used to talk about, move from right to left on our charts, and actually reduce where possible administrative staff and increase on the mission side. And so there has been evidence that we aren't increasing in the leadership oversight managerial type areas where the increases occur. They are direct mission or support, as Regent Simmons was talking about, that there are actual support positions that in our nomenclature show up as administrative but are actually very key to delivering the mission, and there has been some of that as well. So I can tell you without the actual numbers that there is that general evidence that that is what is happening. In terms of doing this to keep tuition down, what I would say is that, and maybe need to think about this a little bit differently, but the way that I think about it, by doing the reallocation, and we'll actually talk about this in the Finance Committee later this morning, some of the reallocations are really, I think, an equal partner to tuition and state funding for funding what we term core mission, or the basic operations of the university. And so if we didn't do those reallocations, we would have larger holes in the budget just to cover cost increases. And that is a way that we are holding tuition back a bit, is by forcing ourselves to reduce existing costs without, saying that this dollar cut here means that, it is tied directly to that tuition dollar. So I don't know if that's helpful, but
it is. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We have a number of regents. I would ask that you be precise and concise in your questions and responses. Regent Swigum.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. First of all, a disclaimer, if I could. Disclaimer being that whatever you guys decide on June 20th for a budget, I will enthusiastically support and publicly support. And the other part of the disclaimer is that in the onboarding that Regent Powell and I have done over the last 3 months, I have met some great people, some really, really wonderful people that I'm very proud of at the university. The Bernies and the Julies and the Kathys and the Gales, wonderful folks. I have yet to decide about you, Brian. You did give me a big hug the last meeting we had, so I think that meant there was a vibe there. You know, the Matts, you need to know that in a previous life, and I'm going to get into my comment now, my question, as this leads me into in a previous life, Matt did come to me in my position and his position and said I had to reduce employment by some 7% in my department. Mr. Kramer, I think you said that directly to me, and I was successful. I did it. Having said that, I look at this budget, Mr. President, thank you for bringing it forward. I'm a little less than impressed, and I'll tell you why. I think that Regent Simmons is correct about our mission, but our mission is also, Regent Simmons, to be efficient, to get a value for the dollars that our students pay. I think is part of our mission. Certainly a value to the citizens of the state, to the taxpayers of the state of Minnesota is very, very important. And to some degree, folks, to some degree, I'm not in the higher education area, and I'm not in the field of higher education. To some degree, the pedestal we put ourselves on in higher education, you know, it's a little wrong. We put ourselves in higher education on a higher pedestal than the rest of the world. You know, when I compare it to the state of Minnesota, which I have done with Julie and Brian significantly, and the president, we pay salaries at higher education significantly higher, not 10%, not 50%, not 100%, sometimes almost 200% higher in higher education than we do the Commissioner of Budget and Finance at the university. I guess I would compare you to him, Brian, your position. Or we pay our security officer here more than the head of the state patrol in the state of Minnesota. We pay the president's chief of staff more than the governor in an $80 billion budget. Governor Dayton pays his chief of staff. There's some problems here, and I think the president has, in his opening sentence, comment, at least, you know, showed that there was a nod. You gave a nod to the disparity. Maybe not to a problem. You don't think it's a problem. I think it happens to be, but you gave a nod to the disparity. Folks, as I look at this, I'll tell you, on June 20th, I'm going to try to prepare, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the right to work with Brian Steves and with Brian Burnett to bring forward a little option. I originally, I'm a compromiser. I'm a soft guy. I'm a guy who wants to get things done. I think we can address this budget by looking at attrition, by reducing some of our head count. Folks, we've gone through Operation Excellence, cost savings of $68 million, and our head count's gone up hundreds of people, right, Brian?
That's correct.
It's gone. Don't give me this cost savings crap. It's something we should be doing all the time, is prioritizing money to the best priority, to the best value. But we're not cost savings, folks. I mean, don't try to sell this down in Kenyon on the farm. It ain't going to work. We can do it through attrition. Salary increases. I'm going to suggest to you, and I'm going to tell you where I'm going to go. On June 20th, you're going to see some type of amendment to not increase tuition, Regent Powell, not increase tuition, and do the 1% solution. 1%, not 5%, not 3%, 1%. 1% over the next 2 years, cutting our head count through attrition. They're not going to tell anybody they lose their job. But through attrition, a 1% solution, and a 2% increase for faculty, a 0% increase for regents, by the way, and a 1% increase for administration rather than 2%. And I think we could avoid any type of an increase in tuition for this year. I think it'd be a good message to the legislature, it'd be a good message to students, be a good message to the state of Minnesota. Tell you where I'm going, and be very upfront about it, Mr. Johnson. Whatever happens, Mr. Chairman, on June 20th, I'll be enthusiastically there supporting the 12 of us that make a decision.
Thank you, Regent Swigum. May I suggest in our debate that we refrain from using just the first names as we talk with people and show the respect accorded? Okay. Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Following Steve, I'm Regent. Regent.
I'm okay with it, by the way.
Thank you. I got a handful of items. I'm going to try to get to some sort of data-based considerations and maybe save some of the more broad stroke commentary for our next meeting. But was going to make this the last comment. I'll make it the first one to sort of maybe move a little bit out of what Regent Swigum was just saying. In the opening remarks, and I thought, and I also appreciated the point made by the President with respect to creating a category for a freeze as a reflection of our understanding of what some of the concerns the legislative leadership appears to have and our commitment to trying to address some of those concerns. But in the statement to say that we didn't receive enough from the legislature to freeze tuition, I would just simply give us a little tip as we go forward into our next biennial budget request or any supplemental budget request. I don't think we made a clear case that that was a priority. So I think it's a little bit unfair for us to try to shift to the legislature the responsibility for not having provided us funding. And I think that came through in some of the statements by some of the higher ed folks that they were at least at some point had the impression that regardless of what they would have provided, we were looking at tuition increases. So I just want to make sure we don't shift that obligation. I think we need to look internal before we look external on those issues. Following a bit on what Regent Powell had talked about in the administrative reductions, I want to kind of change the perspective. This is the way I've been, that I felt for the last couple of years, and of course is informed by my entire membership of this board at varying times. I've never seen that as sort of the set-aside project. I've never seen it as something where we sort of declare this as a focused effort and that this somehow is separate. I really see that as due course. Every year we should be looking at those kinds of considerations, natural attrition and programs that sort of, I mean, we at academic and at the Academic Student Affairs Committee, we are sometimes closing down programs and because there's no longer a demand and new ones are being created. So I'd like to kind of not get away from this sort of hoopla that we've done something really remarkable, even though I do think it is remarkable and it's challenging and it's something that is good. But I've never felt comfortable hanging my hat on that as a reflection for the state that we are, really trying to increase efficiency, because I think you're just doing what's sort of natural. And that came out in your last comments where you said that, I think both of you mentioned that when we get to the 90, that doesn't end it. And so we should continuously revise that. I think that the real reform is going to be in permanent reduction. And I think this has been touched on, and I don't want to belabor that in our short time. I do agree with Regent Simmons that, we have this mission to deliver excellence and to deliver a product. I would take a little bit different take than Regent Swigum in this conversation and just simply saying that our mission also has an obligation to make education at our flagship university accessible to the people of this state. And that means making it affordable for folks. There's a longer conversation in there, but we'll leave that for another time. But I want to talk a little bit about the compensation stuff. I appreciate the fact that we now have a breakout of different categories of employees. I think it can be broken out further because I think within P&A you have some pretty wide variance between different categories of folks that are in that area. It encompasses, such a large number of people. But, we're talking, this is these are hundreds of millions of dollars that we're talking about. And so I don't think that I think it's an excellent step that we now have that broken out. I don't think it's realistic that the market for all of these categories and the categories within the categories are all facing the same pressures. They're facing different pressures. I would request that we receive a clear data analysis, whether it comes from your office, HR. I would certainly hope that we would be able to gather this information to make the case for each group. Why? They're all just sort of almost arbitrarily 2%, 2%, 2%, 2%. I would actually like to understand what's peer compensation. This goes a little bit to Regent Spegham's comments about a similar employee employed by the state, public employee, may have a very different compensation base, in which point then your percentages don't really seem to, to impact as much your capacity to retain. But I want to know, what's peer compensation? What are our attrition rates? Which might be an indicator that we're not paying enough because the cost of turnover is high. And when we have vacancies, what do our applications look like? Are we simply unable to fill positions because our expected compensation? I mean, this is really important information. It's boring to most people, but it's really essential for us to understand this stuff as we're looking at the students. I note that the current non-resident increase of 5.5% for those that are currently here, I support that concept. I've never wanted to see that be an issue, that if somebody comes in with certain expectations, everybody knows that I'd like to see our non-resident rate be comparable to our peers, and I won't go into the bases, but I would even support potentially not a lower increase for our current students to match what our in-state students are seeing as an increase, because it really is about the bargain. If someone comes in with a certain expectation and we change it dramatically, I would not want to put someone in harm's way in that. The increase in NRNR students, as was described, that was anticipated, certainly by those of us that were looking at what's happened at our peers, and so I'm not greatly surprised by that. Very happy to see that, and that does get us to where I think we need to go. I want to make a point about the Promise Scholarship. If you look at that versus Pell Grant and Minnesota State Grant and Aid, the fundamental concept here is state and federal programs, those are pay it forward. People that are out there earning the income are paying taxes that go into these pools that ultimately support students. When we tax our student body with imperfect information about whether anyone actually receives support from parents to whom they're tied, you're paying it backward. They're providing money that's going to pay for other students, as opposed to getting an education in whatever category they want and going out and making a living, whether they want to be a low-income person in a public service type role, or whether they want to go off and make a ton of money in business. It doesn't, I mean, that's I think the proper way. And so I'm concerned about our continued reliance on institutional aid that's derived from tuition.
Regent Rocha, we have 11 minutes left, and we have 6 more regents wanting to comment.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chair, and I guess I can try to present these in other ways. I do understand that other members of the board have had a little more access to administration in conversations about the budget. This is my one shot. So I would like to ask these questions, and then we can, so I can then be prepared when we have the vote to know that the questions have been asked. I would request data on the market circumstances for each campus. We have these increases that are listed for the different campuses. I would like to have a better understanding of what each campus is facing in their relative markets, because I feel like our system campuses, some of them I think are hamstrung a bit by the fact that they're requesting or requiring tuition at a rate higher than their peers as regional institutions, and that actually may be costing us money because we have unmet or unused capacity. I would hope that would be something we could have fairly easy. And then the last thing point I'll make is when we talk about inflation and trying to keep up with inflation for our compensation rates, I think that's laudable, but if it yields an increase in tuition that exceeds the rate of inflation, I think you're saying, well, these folks can't be affected by, we're not going to have these people affected, but our students are going to be. And they're going to be hurt because their increases are going to be greater than inflation. So going to the points of wanting to rein that in, that would be my request, is that we look at a way of, at a base minimum, not imposing an increase greater than the rate of inflation on our students. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Rocha. Regent Omari.
Thank you, Chair Johnson, and to the presenters. I actually just have a point of clarification on slide 15 for the 2016-17 NRNR. It says that there was an increase of 9.9%. My not-so-great memory says it was a 7.5% that we voted on this time last year. Is that correct or incorrect?
Ms. Tonneson?
Mr. Chair, Regent Omari, I believe that is correct.
That I am, or the slide is?
Pardon me?
That I'm correct, or the slide is?
That you are correct.
Okay.
I will double-check that and make the correction for you, if that's the case. I believe it was 7.5% that we actually approved. What I don't know, because I'm not good at math in my head, is whether or not the numbers here, it's just
This is 9.9 in the
okay.
numbers.
All right, I will go back and revise that.
Okay. I just want to make sure that what
apologize.
we voted on is actually what is reflected here. And then I'll just quickly say, I'm curious to know at what point we reach the top of the curve for demand for NR. And so if we know applications are down, yield rate is up, says we're going to take those who can afford to come here from out of state, and some people on the board are perfectly fine with that. And so what we're saying is those who can't afford to come from different states essentially are not going to come unless they can pay the 10% and above based on that yield rate. So is 10% the top of the peak that will make no difference from 50%? I'm very curious about that number, because once we get to that point, which I'm not in favor of, we might as well stop going incrementally and just go all the way if we're just going to take the elitists from other states anyways.
Comment, Ms. Tonneson, Mr. Burnett, or do you need to do a little homework?
Yeah.
They'll be back to you, Regional Mari. Is that okay?
Mr. Chair, I don't know that we have the data for I think there's a lot of theory and opinions on that, and that's a longer discussion about what's the market look like for non-resident.
President Kaler.
Actually, Chair Johnson, I'll yield. That was my point.
Thank you. Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, presenters and staff, for preparing the budget in a relatively short period of time, and for Mr. Kramer for lacing your shoes and participating, getting on the field the second half of the legislative session. And your staff spent so much time at the Capitol. I do want to thank the legislature and the governor for their investment in you, particularly the bonding, the state specials like ag, key investments that you've described. This is my 9th year on the board and a budget cycle, and I've decided to be a little more direct about my view, however, that the state's support of our operating budget is disappointing. This has been a 20-year defunding trend over several administrations, sometimes across party lines, sometimes not. There's been no annual increase for almost 2 decades. I can't really get beyond that fact. And I'm not going to be an apologist for the legislature. I know they're dealing with issues that we can't even begin to understand. The fact is, we have received almost no more money for 2 decades. No one likes to pay operating costs. The feds don't, the state doesn't, donors don't, and operating costs have tails, as Regent Sviggums reminded me. We've got ongoing increases despite our cost cutting. We have investment needs, and we have growing government compliance costs. How are we supposed to fund 100% of those needs under a resident freeze tuition scenario when the only remaining source of new revenue would be the state, which is only a 17% contributor to begin with, and which has just approved a 1.8% annual increase on their base? And federal research grants don't cover the full cost of that research. Those rely on tuition dollars. They rely on state money to fill that. Unless we want to, if we want to get out of the research business, go back to be a $200 million a year research operation, we can save money. We can drop tuition like a rock. So we're relying on a 17% source of our budget under a freeze scenario, that's the state source, to pay 100% of these recurring costs that we've got. And you know, that's a problem. And there's an impression that we're so huge and complex that we've got out of control spending. Regent Broad, who voted for the budget the last 4 years, always studied our spend rate. Our spend rate is lower than the state of Minnesota's. Our spend rate over the last 10 years is 3.5% versus the state's 4.2%. I guess our spend rate is lower than either the 2 cities, either the 2 counties, the school boards. We may be the most cost-contained public institution around the state. I mean, I got to look at these numbers, and the state's investment in transportation, those construction costs go up 6%, healthcare goes up 15%. We're at 3%. In 2015, our spend rate was 1.5%. We've gotten away from those 10% annual increases, and that's got to be stated for the record. Operational excellence, Regent Sviggum, that may sound like an accounting, but those are avoided costs. So unless somebody intervenes with those costs it stops, and those costs continue. So that's real money. That's real money. Over the 6 years, that would have been another 10%. Had we not intervened in those recurring costs, those would have been added to tuition for students. I know we've got to find found money in Regents Figum. I know you're focusing on P&A. The metric I like to use, and I would like to put in our progress card, is the average money an employee of the university handles has gone up from $77,000 to $127,000. That's 64% increase in productivity. If that weren't there, I'd really be concerned, but we're handling more with fewer people. We've got more people, but you got to look at what they're doing, and I use money as that. So I look forward to talking to you. You've had some very thoughtful ideas, Regents Figum, as you joined and raising a lot of questions. There are issues, centralization I'd like to see a little more actively pursued in Navy programming. Thank you, Mr. Chair and colleagues.
Thank you, Regent Beeson. As you can see, between now and next Tuesday, there will be some interesting summits taking place and discussions, which is the reason we're meeting today. Regent Anderson.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. I was just thinking, it's interesting, whoever puts the chairs up here, I'm sitting between Regent Figum and Regent Beeson, and my opinion's kind of right in the middle also.
Thank you for those comments.
Yeah. I had...
Regent Anderson.
Okay, hang on here. I also thought, I was going to say, the budget is, to me, it's kind of like coaching a hockey team in a tie game. Well, we played pretty well, but we didn't win, because there's some good things here. And I was thinking about the student deliverables, what we've been able to deliver on some low cost. We heard the young lady up here, the student regent, and talking about mental health. I remember having that discussion last year, and I'm so glad that some of them are excited about that. We got to continue that to the other campuses. There's some other things. I handed out the diplomas in biological science, College of Biological Science, and to see those 500 or 600 kids come across with these great degrees and going to go to work in graduate school in Minnesota. But we can't forget what we're here for. That being said, like I say, if you looked on slide 17, I think that even though, and I agree with Regent Powell, that we don't want to get to an increase in inflation, having our consumers pay more than we're going to raise the costs. I don't like that, but nobody can say that in the last 6 years, and I can't take credit for it because I'm fairly new here, the regents haven't been diligent and the administration hasn't been diligent in the cost of tuition. 1.4% over 6 years, or 0.5% for those other ones. They've been diligent. They've been diligent, and I also have my theory on regional Mari. I'm for on your non-resident, non-custody race. I'm sorry. I had to hear about this and kind of come to Regent Rocha's conclusion that I think we need to continue to raise that. I think what we've seen is the people who apply at Minnesota simply because we're very, very low in our tuition, they're not applying anymore. But the people who want to come here, they are applying and our yield is better, and I think that speaks volumes for the brand that's been built. I think that speaks volumes. Sometimes those of us in our own state don't see that, the brand that's been built here. So that's on that. I would prefer to see tuition lower for Minnesota kids. We're a Minnesota students. We're a land-grant university. I've got a son that is a senior in high school. We've been going to grad parties the last week or 10 days. When they know that you sit on the board at the University of Minnesota and all these people are applying for college for their kids, they come and talk to you about tuition. There seems to be a great sense, at least in greater Minnesota, that families that make under like $60,000 a year can get most of their tuition paid. And if you're a 34, 35, or 36 ACT student, you're going to get merit-based scholarships. But those of us who are all in the middle of that, the 70,000 to 150, or our kids are, of course, we all live in Lake Wobegon, they're slightly above average, but they're not the 34, 35, 36 ACT. They seem to think they pay the full tuition, and why isn't there something for us? I've heard a lot of that. I think those are things we have to work on, work with the legislature, become a better team. I will tell you, in my 2 years here, I will give President Kaler a great amount of credit in trying to understand that. Just last week, President Kaler and Mr. Burnett came out to Alexandria. They visited our community. They went through the high school. They talked to the high school principal. I think we're learning to understand some of those things, what the students really want and what the parents really need. And I think finally, I always ran my business with revenue enhancement, cost containments. Finally, my last comment, I don't have any question. I think there is a new vision on this board and on the campus about containing our costs. I think that's not so bad. But like I say, it's kind of a tie hockey game. We didn't win, but we played hard, and we played well. So we'll see where that leads us on June 20th.
Very good, Regent Anderson. Thank you. Vice Chair of the Board, Regent McMillan.
I'll yield.
He yields to Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Vice Chair, for yielding. I have a couple comments to make. When I came to school here in 1983, by the time I accepted my offer for acceptance and came to the university in the fall of 1983, the Regents that year increased out-of-state tuition by 25%. Our numbers are nowhere near that, at least the ones that we're talking about now. And I'm looking forward to seeing some of those Regents if they're still around at the dinner tonight. But the 10% increase only gets us to, I think, 13th out of 14th in the Big Ten. And having gone to a bunch of grad parties last weekend, I too was approached by parents, mostly parents, some students, interested in where tuition was going and how it all worked. And I have to say that I was pleased to see in the presentation on page 30 today, and I think also on the last page of the actual budget, attachment 13, a couple different scenarios for freezing and also reducing tuition by 1%. But I was wondering, is it possible to get a couple other scenarios, and this is on the back of your comment about what real inflation is. Could we get a scenario for a 1% and a 1.5% increase? I don't know if these are linear numbers. I assume they're not, so I can't do the math myself. But that would be great if we could get that. And I also think that, you know, it's interesting that we actually have a higher yield this year now that our tuition has started to increase. I think people are starting to recognize, unfortunately, people associate quality with the price tag, and I've said that in the past. I won't go into it again, but I think that we will continue to see greater increases in students not only applying but also actually enrolling as our out-of-state number gets higher. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Further comments and questions from the Regents in regard to the budget for fiscal 18? Regent Cohn, please.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. Well, I want to build on what some of my colleagues have said. First of all, thank you for the presentation. Over the 5 years that our tuition has only increased 1.4%, I think is remarkable. And for system-wide, it's been 0.5%. So I'm going to disagree a bit with you, Regent Anderson, and I don't think it's like a tie hockey game. I think we've won the game, frankly, because I think that is really remarkable. Secondly, when President Kaler came and made his inaugural address, I remember distinctly his saying that that two of his goals are access and excellence. And I think in both ways we have made great strides. We have made great strides in terms of access, although I share Regent Omari's concern with the NRs slightly. And excellence. One of the things this university can be so proud of is that out of public universities in this country, we are 8th in research that we do for a state like Minnesota. I think that's something, that kind of excellence is something that we want to hang on to, and for me, it's such an important element. So I'm very much in favor of this budget, as you probably can tell, and of really emphasizing the value that students get. They get a research experience as an undergraduate, so many wonderful things, and that to maintain the excellence of the university, if it means over 5 years we have to raise the tuition 1.4%, I'm for it.
Thank you, Regent Cohen. Further comments, questions regarding to the budget? Further comments? So, members of the board, keep in mind between now and next Tuesday, we have opportunity to 20th.
It's a week from Tuesday.
Week from Tuesday, I'm sorry. We have opportunity to visit with the administration and have further discussions with one another. I would observe this on my 10th year. This has been the most engaged budget discussion that we have had, the questions, the presentations about where we are in our priorities as a university, and the emphasis on cost reduction has been quite prominent in this discussion today. And we're seeking that balance between tuition and affordability and enrollment at this university and what it costs the students, always keeping in mind, I believe, the students and how that impacts our students at all levels across the state, nation, and the world. So I thank you for your time, and with that, we will adjourn, and our committee meetings will begin at 10:30. It's for 1 hour, 10:30 to 11:30. So that we are adjourned.